So at this point, this application is pretty much finished, but now with all those resolvers and guards we added, there are parts of this application that are broken. For example, if I add a new task here and I click create, I also get this confirmation pop-up here. And that should not be the case. It should only appear if we're leaving this page because we're clicking cancel or because we're using the back button. Therefore, what we might want to do in our new task component file, and there in the can leave edit page can deactivate guard, is that we might want to change our condition here. And what I'll do is I'll add a new signal here, which we could call submitted. Obviously, the name is up to you. And I'll give it an initial value of false. And then here in onSubmit, before I try to navigate away, I'll actually set my signal, my submitted signal, here to true. And now we can simply use that signal here in can leave edit page. And actually, for my purpose here, I don't even need a signal. I can just use a regular property and simply set that to true, because I'm not doing any reactive data binding here. I'm not trying to use it in the template. I don't need a subscription. I don't need to be informed about changes to this submitted property value. Instead, I'm only adding it here so that in can leave edit page, I can add a new check and check if component submitted is true. And if that's the case, I will simply return true here. So put in other words, I'll only run this check if the form has not been marked as submitted. And with this simple yet helpful workaround here, we could go back and enter some data here into this form. And if I click cancel, I get this pop-up. If I press the back button, I get this pop-up as intended. But if I click create, you see I did not get it. And instead, this was created and added. And that's now the behavior I want here. So that's one thing fixed. But there also is another problem with this application here. At the moment in this application, whenever I click complete here on one of my tasks, it doesn't update the UI. If I reload, I can tell that the task actually was deleted, but that's not shown immediately when I click complete. And the reason for that is that when a task is removed, this resolver, which loads my tasks, does not execute again. Because keep in mind that it's this resolver that loads the user tasks that are then made available to the tasks component through this user tasks input. So if this resolver doesn't run again, it's still the old list of tasks that's output by this component. And that includes the task I deleted. Now, that's of course not the behavior I want, and therefore one thing we could do here is go to the task component, where I do trigger the task removal, and also initialize a navigation action here. For that, we can inject the Angular router to perform some programmatic navigation. So I'll inject the router, and for that, of course, the router must be imported. And with that here in onComplete, we can use this router to call navigate. Now, navigate then can be used with an array of route fragments, where the first and only fragment in my case here could be such a relative route fragment, so such a relative path, which should hopefully lead to the same route being loaded again, which hopefully leads to the resolver to run again. But this is actually not how it would work. Instead, we need to add some configuration options here to make this navigation action work correctly, and then we'll also need to tweak some other place in this app. Because one option we need to add here in this navigate configuration object is the relative to property. Because to make sure that Angular navigates relative to the route we're currently on with this navigate method, you must tell Angular that you want to navigate relative to the currently activated route. And you do this by providing the relative to property here, and by then injecting the activated route, as we did it before in other parts of this section as well. So the activated route must be imported and injected. And then here you set relative to this activated route. But that's not all. In addition, you should also set the on-same URL navigation to reload. Because since I'm essentially telling Angular that I want to go to the route I'm currently on, by default it would ignore that navigation and it would not trigger resolvers or anything like that again. So we must set this to reload to get Angular to perform this navigation action as if we would be coming from a different route. But even with this all added, we would still not get the behavior we need. Because in addition, you also need to go to the user routes configuration, and then there on this route config for this tasks route, you should change run guards and resolvers to always, because otherwise Angular would actually not run this resolver function here again, because neither the path parameters nor the query parameters changed. That's why we need always here. Well, and with that, finally, if you save that, if you reload, and I will actually disable this guard here and set this to 1 to make sure that we always end up on this route where I want to go to, since it's a bit annoying otherwise. So with that, if I go back, if I sort here, that works as intended. But if I now click complete here, you see that was updated. So that now worked as intended due to those settings we added to this application. Now, one problem you might still notice is that if you do actually add another task here, if you do sort, and you therefore have query parameters here, if you sort and you then click complete, those query parameters are actually deleted. And to make sure that this is not happening, we should add one last option here to this navigate method. And that's the query params handling option, which you should set to preserve, to make sure that query parameters are preserved. With that, finally, if you go back and you add one more test here real quick, and you click on sort so that you have query parameters. Now if you do that and you click on complete, you see the page updates because the route is kind of reloaded and the query parameters are also still there. And that's now the behavior I want for this application.